and welcome to another video. Today I am just going to be ranting. It's not really something that happens often on this channel, but there have been a couple of things that have irked me over the past 1 or 2 years now that I've been using more patterns and also from different types of designers and different countries, and I just wanted to lay them all out in a video. My first pet peeve is ill taken pictures. This bothers me so much because someone goes through all this effort of trying to bring out a pattern and then the pictures are just not popping, they're just not fire. And it's not even in the sense of, oh, it's a low quality picture or whatever, but it's just the fact that there are a lot of patterns on Ravelry or wherever you go to buy patterns where the picture of the full garment is just not clear. I've seen patterns where they only show the front and not the back of the garment, or the worst offenders in my opinion are when you have the models that are in positions like and it's with those patterns in particular that you just know that there is some flaw about this pattern. Maybe the armhole depth is weird, or the sleeve is doing some suspicious things, and you just know that this model is trying their best to hide the fact that something is kind of wrong with this pattern, and that just bothers me so much. For me, I would just like, when I'm going to buy a pattern, just know what I'm dealing with, and if I at the very least know that there's an issue, I can weigh in on whether or not I have the capability and the willingness to change that myself. But going in blind is just something I don't want to do, so I do try my best to avoid those patterns. Up next, I have patterns that don't have schematics. And this is actually, I guess, not the norm to have a schematic included with your pattern, but it is so frustrating for me because I really enjoy making my own modifications when I'm knitting, and it makes the process so much harder when the only measurement that I have is just the full bust measurement. Because now, instead of knowing how many rows shorter I might need to knit in order to make the armhole depth a bit shorter or more shallow, I have to go through the entire pattern and then calculate row by row how many rows there are in total, and it's just such a hassle. And I really don't understand why pattern designers don't just add schematics. I feel that there is also, I guess, a sort of, how should I say this, a fear that if someone knows the full measurements of the garment, that they're not going to buy the pattern. But I feel that those people who have the ability to even do that probably aren't even your target audience. So I don't know, it's just very frustrating for me, especially when it comes to all these drop shoulder oversized sweaters. I tend not to get those patterns because I am rather short and these kind of look a bit ridiculous on me, and so I generally have to make some adjustments when it comes to armhole depth or bust circumference or even arm length, and it's just a hassle having to go through the pattern and calculate that. This is also the reason why I really enjoy knitting both German and Japanese patterns, because they always include the schematics and it makes the entire process so much easier, and you're just increasing your chance of getting a better fitted garment, in my opinion. Next up is jank sizing. I recently made a pattern that that included sizes S, M, L, XL and double XL, I believe, but no mention as to what that exactly meant. And that is something that really baffles me. It's kind of wild because we've gone from patterns not having schematics to I'll raise you one higher and I'll just assign random letters to sizes, and you're just gonna have to figure out which one is yours. I don't even have much else to say about this. It makes the pattern unmakeable, or at the very least, it makes it a pattern where you are most certainly not going to get the right size on your first try. Then the last point with regards to sizing, I believe that really irks me are the size inclusive patterns that are made to measure. I don't want to be shady, but I have a theory that with these types of patterns, it's actually the designer who doesn't know how to grade sizes, and so they just tell you what they did for their specific size and then kind of hope that that's going to work for every single person. That's not necessarily size inclusive. That's just not size inclusive at all, to be honest. The thing is, it's not that you can't make a size inclusive made to measure patterns, but what I've seen with a lot of these is that the differences, the changes in proportions that happen when you go from smaller sizes to larger sizes or the other way around, those are not taken into account. And it's actually rather easy to clock these particular made to measure patterns because you'll see the test samples and the fit on two different sizes will be completely different. And what baffles me the most with these types of patterns is that often they're even more expensive than the ones that are actually fully graded. And for me, that's the cherry on top. Okay, so this one is, I think, the genesis of this video. I was in the library and I don't know what happened, but I just was insanely triggered by this, and I think I wrote down 3 pages in this book about what really irks me about this practice when it comes to pattern designers, and that is when pattern designers copyright basic patterns, not in the sense of you can't spread these instructions because obviously there's copyright on it. You can't just send them off to other people or just spread them however you want. The thing that bothers me is when they say that you can't sell the pieces that you've made using that pattern. I'm already feeling my blood cook again. It's so wild to me how many designers add that to their copyright. What makes you think that you can have ownership over someone else's property just because you gave instructions on how to make it? That's just very, very weird to me. I don't know how to describe it, but it feels like such an disingenuous thing to do, to add to your copyright, especially when it comes to the craft of knitting. I mean, if just looking at the history of knitting, it's been a craft that has, for one, brought people together to share and learn together, and also it has been a source of income for so many people, their way of surviving. And I personally believe that there is no single way that any of the patterns that we're using right now, that are being written right now, could exist if they didn't use the knowledge from people from centuries, decades ago. And so, for one person in that line of information that has been passed on from generation to generation to say, ho, 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 stop, 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 stop. No, you cannot sell this basic raglan sweater that I happen to design. It's so gatekeepy, and for me, it comes off that either the designer doesn't realize or refuses to accept that what they're making is not new. They are not reinventing some new thing. And I've noticed this even more so now that I have been knitting vintage patterns. The amount of times that I've come across modern patterns that in 1940s, 30s vintage magazines is baffling. Yeah, there might be some different tweaks here. The fit might be a bit looser. There might not be such puffy sleeves or anything like that. But it's basically the same thing. And so for me, it's very wild to see someone tell other people that they can't sell the thing that they've made, as if they haven't put any effort into the piece at all, and it's just all because of your instructions. I mean, you have people copywriting basic sock patterns or just basic scarf patterns. How are you going to copyright a double knitted scarf? So whenever someone else wants to sell a double knitted scarf, does that mean that they are all of a sudden violating your copyright and you're gonna go after them? Like, I really dislike how selling your knitted items is getting discouraged by designers. I think someone who really understands this perfectly is Dot's Pebble. I believe her name is Claire Garland. She is the woman who knits up all these cute stuffed animals, and when you buy one of her patterns, at the bottom of the pattern it says that you can sell whatever you make from her patterns, and I think something like that she'd like to see them as well, so you can tag her and she'll actually repost what you've made. And if you think about it, right, this is such a smart business strategy. It might not have been a business strategy, but this is such a smart idea because, for instance, I believe there is one person on Instagram who makes frogs that are knit using the patterns of Claire, and that account is so popular. And now I am 100% sure that there have been a number of people who have seen that frog and thought, whoa, that is cute. I want to make that as well. And then go to Dot Pebbles and buy that pattern. It's free marketing basically, but and also another thing that I don't understand about this as well is how is someone selling knits that used your instructions, how is that impeding on your bottom line? Because if you think about the clientele of designers, right, you have people who buy the pattern because they don't know how to knit it up themselves, and there are people who buy the pattern because they know how to knit it up themselves, but they just don't want to do the math. They just want something that they can follow and just make it. And that's completely fine. The thing is that these people are not the same as those who go and buy handmade knit things, because I think a lot of knitters would rather just knit it themselves than buying it off of somebody. So it's just very hard for me to understand why a lot of designers add this in. I think also some don't even think about what it means to add that copyright in there and just do it because a lot of big popular designers do it. And also on top of that, this type of copyright isn't even enforceable in many countries. For instance, if you look at the UK, the only thing with regards to knitting that you can actually copyright is or are the instructions. You can't copyright the item. So, like, how are you even going to enforce that in the first place? It makes absolutely no sense at all. I think the only thing that I might understand is, for instance, if you make a sweater that is very distinct to your brand, for instance, if it has, I don't know, your brand name on it. A lot of the times, the designs that are being copyrighted like this are designs that have existed for decades. And I just think it's just very disingenuous. Another pet peeve is when the product page has little to no information. So I guess that kind of goes hand in hand with not including schematics or I don't know, things like that. But for instance, I've seen patterns where there's just absolutely nothing, not even the yarn is mentioned. Just you have to buy it in order to know exactly what you might need, how much. And for me, I would never buy such a pattern because I feel like if you are already so guarded when it comes to the type of yarn that you use, how can I and you think that even that is, I don't know, insider information, then your pattern is probably not that good. I've even seen people where you have to send them an email to ask for additional information. And I don't know, that's so weird. I definitely feel that there's this type of gatekeeping within knitting. I don't know how long this type of stuff has been going on, but it's it's I feel like it's the antithesis of knitting. It's very strange to see people be so hush and quiet. I don't want to share this with you. I don't want to share that with you. I guess I get it. Of course, I understand when it comes to sharing patterns because that's obviously copyright violation, but not even wanting to share the type of yarn that you're using is for me a bridge too far. Another thing about patterns that I really don't like is when it's in a PDF and there are all sorts of pictures sprinkled throughout the entire page. And that means that if you want to print out the page, you're going to have to waste ink on some useless pictures that you don't need. And because it's in a PDF file, you can't just delete them. That's something that really bothers me because I like printing out things and it's just such a waste. I'd rather have all the pictures on top and then just have the pages with the instructions just blank, clear, not blank, but just very clear and concise. And I think another pet peeve is when people make such long sentences and descriptions for patterns, just a wall of text. It it's so hard for me to get through those because I generally also like to read through a pattern before I start reading it, and having to read, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 pages of full text with instructions is just it's really hard for me to get through. But I think that's also just a preference. I know there are a lot of people who actually enjoy having everything explained again and again and again, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for me personally, I like it when things are very concise, and for things that might need clarifications that you might have to go somewhere else. For instance, if I don't know, this German short rows or something like that, that there's a link or whatever to how to do that, and not explained again in the pattern, and then on the next page it's explained again. It's too much information. Another thing that I find to be very annoying is when people use different abbreviations or name certain techniques in a different way. So they're just kind of veering off the standard abbreviations. I mean, do I even have to explain why this is so bothersome? You have to do extra steps to figure out exactly what they mean, and then also confirm again that that is actually what they mean, because it's kind of weird that there is this standard and you're not using it. So does that mean that you're alluding to something different, or is it just that you think you discovered this, or you think this particular name is better and so you are not using the standard type of abbreviations or names? That's such a mind-boggling situation. It really reminds me of the times in school that you have a multiple choice question and there are two answers that are slightly different but almost essentially the same, and you're just going over like, is it this, but do they actually mean this, but what's the difference between this and this, and so does that actually mean that this is the answer? But and then you've lost 20 minutes to just one question. Yeah. I think the last one I have is when there's a pattern that has multiple sizes, but the way you download patterns is that you have to pick one size and then the pattern only contains that one specific size. I guess there are people who find that to be very convenient, but I don't really like that, because when you have more of the sizes that are included in the pattern, you can kind of see what the designer did in order to grade things up. And so for me, that gives me quite some insight on how I might want to modify something. For instance, if I need shorter sleeves, or if I need to, I don't know, do something with the body. For instance, recognizing the stitch pattern count, things like that. I find it very helpful to see all the different sizes next to each other. And I think, okay, the last one that I want to say is fancy. Fancy letter types. I think that's how you call it. No, fonts. That's what. Letter type is a straight translation from Dutch. Fonts. Fancy fonts in a pattern. I really can't with those. I feel that fancy fonts have no place in a pattern. It makes just everything harder. I get that there are people who have their style, what's it called, their style guidelines, and they have a certain aesthetic that they want to show, but once that aesthetic starts impeding on the legibility of the pattern, I think we need to stop and go back to Calibri or even Comic Sans for that matter. So I think that's all the ranting that I need to do for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon in another video. Bye bye!